Today we're moving on to modern philosophy, and the first, quote, modern philosopher, although he exhibits many medieval characteristics, is Rene Descartes. Okay, Descartes is a very famous figure in the canon. Not necessarily for his conclusions. His conclusions, to be honest, are a little bit weird, but for his method. In other words, the approach that he takes to philosophy. If you look at the ancient world and the medieval world, what you find is an approach to philosophy that begins with credulity rather than incredulity. By that I mean philosophers tend to assume that the world is the way it appears to be, and that they can trust that the world is the way they think it is. In other words, they have a natural credulity towards their sensorial faculties and towards the world around them. But Descartes approaches philosophy in a very different way. He employs a method of systematic doubt. And it is this incredulous, doubting stance that he takes that is very influential in the history of philosophy and in human thought more generally, and that characterizes the modern era over and against the classical, ancient, and medieval eras. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about Descartes' backgrounds, okay, a few biographical comments, and then we'll start in on talking about some of the philosophical concepts present in the Meditations. Okay, so Descartes was a Frenchman, educated at La Flèche. He was born at a time period when new ideas about science were beginning to take root and were beginning to displace classical views of the world. Okay, so let me just give you an example of one such idea. Okay, I have here a pencil, right? And if I let go of this pencil, we would say, obviously it would fall, and we would say gravity has caused it to fall. Okay, and gravity is this we know not what force of attraction that ties bodies with mass to each other and causes them to want to move toward each other. Okay, that would not have been the classical or ancient explanation that would be given for why the pencil falls at all. Aristotle, for instance, would have said the reason why the pencil falls when you let go of it is because there is some property within the pencil itself that is causing the pencil to want to fall, or causing the pencil to move toward its natural telos, or end, or goal, which is to fall in this particular case. Okay, the idea that what is actually causing the movement in the pencil is something that is outside of the pencil itself, and something, moreover, that we can't see, that is this invisible force of attraction, is an incredibly powerful idea, but it's not one that occurred to the ancients or to the medievals. And it required extraordinary rebellion against the whole perception of the world that was present in ancient and medieval philosophy. Namely, in particular, a rejection of the idea of final causes, or end states, or goals for things. And Descartes is an important part of this. Descartes' method of systematic doubt leads to a widespread rejection of the idea of a telos for everything, or a goal, or an end for everything, okay, which was an archetypal principle in the ancient and medieval world. If things don't have goals or ends that can be naturally discerned, then that's, in one sense, I suppose, a liberating thing, because we are free to now propose other explanations for why they do what they do, such as gravity being the reason why the pencil falls when you let go of it. But in another sense, it led to incredible chaos and has led to enormous worldview chaos in the modern world, because nowadays people aren't born with a natural goal or end to human life like they would have perceived themselves as being in the ancient and medieval worlds. In other words, nowadays people think that the explanation for life's meaning is an open question. It's a quest. One must always find what is the reason for meaning in life. But this is not a question that would have occurred to the medievals or the ancients at all, because they believed that humans have natural ends, goals, telos, that can be perceived by observation of the human being. Okay, but that's a little bit further afield. Let me go back to the biographical elements of Descartes, and then we'll talk about the meditations and how that leads to that larger discarding of the ancient idea of natural goals or ends for things. Okay, Descartes was a good student at La Flèche. He studied hard to master scholastic philosophy in particular, which was a school of thought that arose in the aftermath of Thomas Aquinas. And he became very good at it, although he rejected a lot of its principles. And it is in opposition to Aquinas that it's best to think of Descartes as functioning. He is what he is by virtue of his rejection of a lot of Thomistic and Aristotelian ideas. Okay, Descartes, after he graduated, he decided he was going to live the life of a mercenary soldier. So for about the next 10 years, he gallivanted across Europe, fathering children, fighting in wars, and generally becoming kind of a rake. Okay, a rake is an older word for somebody who's living a debauched life. But he decided to sober up in his early 30s and devote his life to something legitimate and purposeful. And so he devoted himself to science, to philosophy, and to mathematics. Okay, and one of the famous texts that he wrote was the Meditations, but he also wrote other works like the Discourse on Method and others as well. Okay, and he wasn't even necessarily primarily a philosopher. Back in the day, humans didn't have the separation of disciplines like we have now. Nowadays, if you study something in the humanities, that's seen as decidedly different than something in the sciences. But this wasn't a notion that people in Descartes' time had at all. Okay, and in fact, Descartes was primarily conceived of himself, at least, as being a mathematician, and conceived of some of the most famous tools that we use in contemporary mathematics. Descartes has actually tormented you for years, and you didn't realize it. Conceived of the Cartesian coordinate system, the graphical illustration of algebraic equations, among other things. Okay, Descartes was well known as a biologist. He practiced vivisection. Okay, does you guys know what vivisection is? It's like dissection. Yeah, let me put the word up here. But it's a special kind of dissection. It is. That's correct. Okay, it is the dissection of living animals. And so we don't really practice that anymore, but it's seen as ethically unjustifiable now. But you open up the dog and rip out a couple nerves and see what happens, and then well, I don't want to describe it, but you carve up the stomach as the dog's alive and see what the dog thinks about that and stuff like that. Okay, so anyway, it's a way to learn a lot about animals, but it's not something that I necessarily think is very humane. Last background comment, Descartes became very famous later in life. Okay, after he had published many works and became very influential in mathematics and philosophy. And actually the Queen of Sweden offered him an enormous amount of money to move to Sweden and to teach her philosophy. So he accepted, okay, and moved to Sweden, which is a very cold location in Scandinavia. And unfortunately for Descartes, that first winter was especially cold. And the Queen of Sweden, Queen Christina, had the habit of getting up at 6 a.m., rising at 6 a.m., and requiring him to give her philosophy lessons. And after a few weeks of this, poor Descartes caught pneumonia from the cold conditions and lingered for a few more weeks before dying in Sweden. So the unfortunate story is he actually died doing philosophy, rising early to do philosophy. So it's an unfortunate ending for a very famous philosopher. You can see his grave today in Paris on the left bank. I have been there. He's a very famous person in the canon. Let me talk about the meditations and the background to the meditations. Actually, are there any questions about Descartes' life and times? All right, let me talk a little bit about the meditations. Okay, the meditations is a deceptively easy text. It's written in a very folksy style. He imagines himself sitting by the fire, thinking about this piece of beeswax he's holding in his hand and its philosophical properties as he looks at the fire and in his slippers and in his bathrobe. And then he imagines himself going on this week-long journey of thought and invites you to come with him as he cogitates about the properties of the world around him and of the objects in his immediate surroundings in his room. Okay, but it's deceptively easy because it actually covers some incredibly important concepts. Descartes is especially important in the field of epistemology. Okay, epistemology, as I've mentioned before, is a field devoted to the study of knowledge. What is knowledge? What can we know? What are the limits of our knowledge? Can we trust what we know? What is the scope of our understanding? Those are the kinds of questions that are asked in the field of epistemology. Okay, and Descartes is really famous in the canon because of his influence in epistemology, and especially on questions of knowledge. Descartes naturally doubts the efficacy of his knowledge. He doesn't think that his knowledge is something that is actually necessarily what he considers it to be. Okay, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But the Meditations ends on a much more positive note than it begins on. So Descartes initially does doubt a number of things, but he ends by retrieving all the knowledge that he had artificially bracketed and led himself to doubt. Let me talk a little bit about that process. The first and second meditations are imaginative reflections on the limits of human knowledge. Okay, so Descartes asks us to journey with him and to think about how certain our knowledge actually is. And when we do so, we find that there are all sorts of things that are actually not as certain as we might initially think. Okay, and Descartes himself says, there are numerous opinions that I now hold that I didn't once upon a time hold and that I may not hold in the future. Why do I think now that they happen to be true? Okay, so let me just offer you guys a few examples of this. First of all, we could start with our senses. How often has knowledge derived from our senses deceived us? Okay, you're driving along the road. You see off in the distance, maybe you're driving in West Texas, there's desert all around. You see off in the distance a large lake coming up, you drive closer, it turns out it's a mirage, there was no lake there. Your senses deceived you. You thought you had knowledge that you could trust, turns out you didn't. You're walking out there on Holcomb Mall. You see someone coming towards you. He looks very tall. You get closer, he's actually very short, but his slim build made you believe that he was tall by virtue of your senses deceiving you. Okay, so our senses deceive us all the time. And Descartes says, if our senses deceive us, why should we trust them about anything? Okay, if they've deceived us once or twice or many times, why do we continue to believe them? It's not just sensorial knowledge that can deceive us. There are other kinds of knowledge as well. the actual amount of knowledge that human beings accumulate about the world directly from their own perceptions is very small. The great majority of our knowledge about the world comes from the opinions of others. Okay, that might be opinions written down in a book. So you read a book and learn about the world that way. It might be opinions told to you through media devices or verbally directly from some other person. But the great majority of our knowledge about the world comes from others. Okay, so for instance, I am told that there is a very large city in Florida called Miami. I have never been to Miami. I am told that this place exists. Numerous people in my life have referred to this place and told me that Miami exists. I have never experienced it for myself. I must rely upon the opinions of others. Now, others often deceive us. Okay, others often do not tell us the truth about their own experiences or about the nature of the world. It's a problem that historians have to work with all the time, right? So historians, reading sources from the past, they tend to take a naturally incredulous stance toward these sources. Because, you know how much humans of the present lie. Well, humans of the past lied just as much. And humans of the past often lied about what they did in the documents that they left for posterity. So who knows what was actually going on and whether the people who have left us documents about the past were actually telling us the truth. Right? But if you think about the opinions of others, often those opinions turn out to be false. Okay, so why should we be credulous and believe those opinions? So for instance, here's one other example. I have been told by reading history books that George Washington was the first president of the United States. Okay? I've never experienced that directly. No one who I have met who is alive today experienced that directly. All the people who have told me this are dead and left books for posterity. Now, I believe that this was the case because there are a lot of different sources that attest to it. But still, there is no direct personal experience that I can fall back upon. It is just testimonial knowledge that is required for me that I have to believe in order to believe this fact about the past. Testimonial knowledge often is unreliable. Okay, and in fact, actually, I was talking with Professor Hinsey the other day, and he says he's an attorney by profession, and he tells me that the evidence in the courtroom that is most unreliable is witness testimony. Because people think they remember, and it's not necessarily planned. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is like intentional deception on the part of witnesses. But often it's just people misremembering. People think they remember something, and apparently, as Professor Hinsey tells me, actually they don't at all. And the situation wasn't at all what they thought it was, and they just misperceived it. So apparently this is so widespread that witness testimony is well known in his profession as being the least reliable form of courtroom evidence. Okay, so it's not just our own sensory perceptions that are unreliable sometimes. It is also the testimony of others, facts that are provided to us in books or told to us by others who have had direct experiences themselves. These things can be unreliable as well. Okay, so Descartes starts with this observation about the unreliability of our senses. And he then pursues on this basis a method of doubt. He says, look, I want in these meditations to embark upon an investigation where I can find some form of knowledge that is certain, that I can know for sure. Okay, and that I cannot dispute, some form of knowledge that has to be the case, that cannot ever waver. And certainly it can't be knowledge derived from his senses, because his senses have often deceived him. It can't be knowledge derived from others, from testimonial perceptions, because those have often been deceptive as well. He even at one point imagines himself being deceived by a demon. Okay, he's imagining himself at one point in the first meditation. He thinks to himself, what if a cosmic demon has actually presented the world to my senses as being a particular way, when in fact the real world is something completely different, and what's really just happening is I'm being deceived by an immensely powerful cosmic force. Okay, a far-fetched scenario for sure, but I take it that Descartes' point is that once his senses have failed him, why should he trust them anymore? Okay, so it's a project of radical doubt. He even at one point imagines himself as being asleep. Right, so we all know how real dreams can be. We all know that often when you're dreaming, you think that you're awake, and you wake up and you realize it was just a dream. So how do you know when you're dreaming and when you're waking? This is the basis for a famous Cartesian movie recently called Inception. Right, everybody see Inception? You guys haven't seen Inception? Yeah. It was Inception. It does fiddle around a bit with the idea of a dream within a dream. Yeah, it's a Leo DiCaprio movie, well-known movie. The movie is an exploration of how you can know when you're dreaming and when you're awake, among other things. It explores a lot of other topics, but it's a real Cartesian-inspired exploration. Yeah, so in the movie, what they have are these little tokens, totems, they call them, that enable them to realize when they're awake and when they're dreaming. Okay, it's just a fictional plot device. But to be honest, there have often been times in my dream state where I've thought that it was real. And it turned out it was a dream. Okay, now right now I'm pretty confident this is not a dream. It's got a level of clarity and distinctness. My perceptions have a level of clarity and distinctness that my dreams just don't ever have. But at the same time, when I'm having dreams, I often think that they are real. Maybe you have the same experience, maybe you don't. But Descartes wonders, could this all be a dream? Okay, so he kind of explores a method of systematic doubt that's pretty radical, wondering if all his perceptions of the world around him are just a dream or some cosmic deception that a demon has foisted upon him. Okay, so that's the background to the methodological doubt. Are there questions or comments about that? Yes?
So if your own perceptions aren't worthy of being, you can't really trust them, and other people's input is also found to be untrustable, I'm not sure of this word. How would he even discern information at that point?
Great.
On terms, if you can't trust them and you can't trust other people, how do you even gather information?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So that's the problem that he finds himself facing in the meditations, is if I can't trust what other people tell me, and I can't trust even what I myself perceive, then what can I trust? Is there knowledge that I can find that is certain, that must be the case? Okay, self-evident, certain knowledge. And he reasons that if he can find such knowledge, some certain fact, then maybe, just maybe, he can use that fact, that certainty, to rebuild in his life other forms of knowledge that he can trust again on the basis of the certain fact that he knows for sure. So that's exactly the situation he finds himself in, is what can I trust if I can't trust others and I can't trust myself in terms of what I know? What can I trust? What is actually knowledge that I can have confidence in? Yes?
I'm trying to wrap his way of thinking around in my head, and at that point, with his way of thinking, you can't trust anything. his own perceptions, okay, that's gone.
Mm-hmm.
And then other people's perceptions. And even then, it's your perception taking in their perception, so wouldn't his logic be flawed, kind of?
Yeah, so, well, it is a problem. He can't get out of his own head. Once you start down this train of thought, and you not only mistrust others, but you mistrust your own senses, your own faculties are untrustworthy. What can you do in order to find certain knowledge? Okay, so it might be helpful to conceive of the Cartesian project in terms of a visual illustration. This will help me also explaining to you guys why he's doing what he's doing and what he's trying to accomplish. Again, Descartes is, it's kind of a radical project that he's engaged in. So bear with him and be a charitable reader. Let me try to draw my Descartes face. He's French and has a nice goatee. He's got a youth pastor goatee. I wish I could show you pictures of him, but I can't do it on the current technology setup that we've got with our projector in this classroom. Okay, so there's Descartes. And here are things in the world. Okay, obviously he doesn't have cars in his day, but cars are objects in the world, physical objects. There's a tree, there's a house, other people. And Descartes has bracketed these things with like a curtain of doubt. We'll call it a curtain of doubt. And since his knowledge of all of these things comes to him through his senses, and since his senses are untrustworthy, he cannot necessarily trust them because they've failed him before. So once you've failed, once a sensorial faculty has failed, he thinks you can't trust it anymore. He thinks that what he ends up having is this doubt curtain that separates him from the world as he perceives it. So he can't be sure that any of this stuff is the way it appears to him, he thinks. And he thinks also that he can't be sure even that it exists at all. It could be a projection of his own mind. Okay, what can he know for sure if all the knowledge that he receives from the testimony of others is faulty or is assumed to be faulty, and all the knowledge that he receives from the operation of his own sensorial faculties is assumed to be faulty as well? What can he know for sure? What still remains? It's a famous Latin formula describing this. The answer is his own existence. The famous Latin formula is cogito ergo sum, although he never actually uses this formula in this form. Cogito ergo sum literally means I think, therefore I am. His own existence is what he can still know for sure. Okay, and why does he think he can know that? Because he is thinking. Because he thinks about his own existence. Therefore, he must exist. Okay, the fact of his thought is what proves his existence. As long as he can keep thinking, he continues to exist, and he knows that for sure. He can trust that for sure. Trust his own existence, in his own existence. Whatever else might be untrustworthy as a piece of knowledge or form of knowledge, at least he can trust in his own existence because of his use of his cognitive faculties. As long as he can keep thinking, he knows that he exists. And it is the fact of his thought that demonstrates his existence and that demonstrates a certain piece of knowledge that he can rely upon from now on throughout his life. Okay, now, this seems like a really self-evident thing to me. Okay, but this is really famous in the canon because it's a notion or an approach to philosophy which is novel. I'll explain why in a minute. Questions or comments about the famous cogito formula? Or about any of this so far? Yes?
Wouldn't his own thoughts also be in a way his own perception, though?
Good comment. Even though he can't think of anything without imagining products of his sensorial perception, right? If you were to close your eyes, right? If I were to close my eyes, right? And you try to think thoughts, it is impossible for us to think thoughts that don't derive at some level from our sensorial perceptions. Right? Everybody track that? I mean, if you imagine something that doesn't exist, like a unicorn, right? Still, you are accumulating things that do exist in your mind, connecting them up with each other, horned animals and horses, and imagining the non-existing unicorn. So it's still derivable from your senses. Okay, for Descartes, all of his thoughts still come from his senses, and he can't trust his senses. However, he knows that he is thinking. Okay, he knows that his thoughts are occurring, even if they're coming from his senses, or derivable ultimately from his senses. As such, he must exist. He must have real existence. Okay, so he starts with this indisputable fact about his own existence. He thinks that this is the beginning for the foundation of philosophy for him. This indisputable fact about his own existence. And it is existence that is demonstrated by virtue of his thought occurring. As long as he is a thinking thing, then he must exist. Okay, questions or comments? Does everybody track it so far? Some of this seems pretty self-evident. Okay, now, if you're like me, when I first read the Meditations, my first thought was, duh. Of course you exist, dude. Of course that's self-evident. Okay, but this is really actually a very profound approach to doing philosophy and to thinking about human life. Why is it profound? It's profound because of the method that he approaches it with. And that is, he starts with doubt rather than belief. He doubts his senses. And in fact, actually, the vast majority of scientific discoveries that have occurred over the last several hundred years in the wake of Descartes have arisen because thinkers have thought to themselves, the real explanation for this phenomenon must not be the immediate sensorial explanation. There must be a deeper explanation. In other words, they have doubted the appearance of it to understand how it really works. Okay, an approach to life and to philosophy and to the scientific method that assumes that the true explanation for a particular phenomenon is not the obvious one, and that there must be some deeper underlying non-intuitive explanation that accounts for this phenomenon, is a revolutionary approach. Okay, and actually we found out in the 20th century, quantum physicists have told us that when you drill down to microparticles and investigate matter at its most basic fundamental form, like really small particles, stuff gets really weird. And it's not as it appears to be at all. For instance, matter appears to be pretty stable when you're looking at it at a macro level, the level of our senses. But at a micro level, it's not stable at all. In fact, they can't predict where particular electrons are going to be at any particular time. They can just say with probability where they're going to be. Because to actually identify an electron is to alter its orbit by virtue of the fact of the identification occurring and taking place. And so matter actually is really unpredictable and weird and governed by probabilities but not certainties once you drill down to microparticle levels. Okay, but in general, to back up, the point is the method of doubt is really influential. And the idea that the world is not as it appears to be, and the true explanation for the world is not what it appears to be, is really influential. It's an important step in the history of philosophy. Okay, all right, so that's how we get to there and why that's important. Another reason why this is important, Descartes starts with his own existence. He starts with self. He begins from an anthropocentric perspective. He does not begin from a theocentric perspective. He begins by assuming his own existence. And from that, he is a Christian, he's a Catholic. He's a good faithful Catholic, but he starts by demonstrating his own existence and from there going on to reason about the existence of God. He does not start by assuming God's existence. And that's a really big step in the history of philosophy, a very big methodological change. Okay, Descartes himself is a Catholic, but his approach to doing philosophy was a way of doing philosophy that caused later philosophers to turn in a non-theistic, atheistic direction, to think that maybe the world it just has always been or something, or the universe has just always been and there's no God or no explanation beyond the immediate appearance of our deliverances of our senses that accounts for why the world is the way it is. Okay, so the anthropocentric origins of the Meditations project are really important. Okay, how do you guys think that he's going to trust his senses again and trust testimonial knowledge again? How is he going to believe once more in the existence of things like cars and trees and people and houses? Like, what do you guys think he's going to do in order to trust this knowledge once more? Any speculation? Okay, cool. All right, so he thinks that if he can, on the basis of his own existence, he knows that he exists, because he's a thinking thing. He thinks that if he can prove God's existence and prove that God is a truth teller, God would not lie, then he can get beyond this curtain of doubt, here to here, and once again trust the deliverances of his senses. Okay, well, how might he do that? Well, if he can prove God's existence, and if he can also demonstrate that God is a truth teller, then God would not lie to him about the nature of the world. God would not lie to him about the deliverances of his senses. God would guarantee that the world is, in fact, or at least, corresponds to the way his senses perceive the world as being. Okay, of the arguments for God's existence that we covered when we talked about Aquinas, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the ontological argument. Remember, the cosmological argument is the argument that says there was a first thing. There had to have been a first cause. The teleological argument is the argument that says that where there is complexity, there is a complex origin or a complex source, complex designer. Okay, we find extraordinary complexity in the universe for sure. And then the ontological argument, which says that there must be a greatest possible being, because to exist in reality is greater than to exist in the mind alone. And if the greatest possible being only existed in the mind alone, then it would not be the greatest possible being, since existence in reality is greater than existence in the mind alone. Okay, so the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the ontological argument. Of those three arguments, is there one of those three that does not rely upon knowledge derived from our senses? In other words, is there an argument for God's existence that he can use behind the curtain without appealing to the certainty or truth of sensorial perceptions? Is there a way of demonstrating, for him to demonstrate God's existence, or an argument at least, for demonstrating God's existence that that he can appeal to, even if he is doubting that the world is presented to him, as presented to him by his senses, is as it appears to be, or even that it exists at all? Is there still an argument for God's existence that he can appeal to? Which of those three might be still available to him?
I'd say maybe the ontological argument.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, that's the answer, is the ontological argument. And the reason why is because the cosmological argument requires, as an assumption, that you believe that things exist around you. Right? You have to believe that, there are real tables and chairs, and those tables and chairs had causes, and the causes of those causes also existed, and there were causes of causes of causes, and so on, back to a first cause. And the teleological argument quite clearly requires you to believe that things around you exist. The deliverances of your sensorial perceptions are referencing real things, because you have to believe in the existence of these complex objects and a complex world in order to reason about there being possibly a complex origin or a complex designer. But the ontological argument does not reference any sensorial perceptions. So it can be used by Descartes behind this curtain of doubt in order for him to prove God's existence. And so that's what he's going to do. He actually has a couple different arguments for God's existence in the course of the meditations, but the one that seems to be doing the primary amount of legwork here is the ontological arguments, the notion that there must be a greatest possible being. And that greatest possible being must really have real existence, be really the case, and therefore the existence of that greatest possible being can guarantee the deliverances of his senses. So he can believe once more, we'll get there eventually in the meditations, he can believe once more in the deliverances of his senses because the greatest possible being can guarantee that. Now, how does the greatest possible being guarantee that? Well, the step that Descartes makes, the key step, is he assumes that one of the characteristics of the greatest possible being must be truth-telling. Because the greatest possible being would not be the greatest possible being if it were a liar, since truth-telling is a great-making property. So God must be a truth-teller, is what he reasons. God would not be a systematic liar, because then God would not be the greatest possible being. He, Descartes, who does have real existence, would presumably then be greater than God, because he is not lying to himself about his own existence. That's self-evident. Okay, so God must be a truth-teller, he reasons. And if God tells the truth, then God must stand behind the existence of the sensorial world as a kind of a guarantee that it is a real thing. Okay, and maybe his senses do sometimes deceive him. Maybe he does not accurately perceive the nature of that sensorial world, but the sensorial world must be real. Because God, being a truth-teller, would not be the cosmic demon who he thinks of in Meditation 1 as systematically deceiving him, because then God would not be the greatest possible being. Okay, now that's a good bit of legwork, and there are a few details in the middle that I am going to try to fill in the next couple class sessions. But we're moving along a little bit at a steady clip. Are there questions or comments about any of that so far? Okay, one last comment on my part today. I want to remind you guys that, so Descartes is going to get to some conclusions that are a bit weird. Okay, and I consider them to be pretty weird too. I think that this guy had a lot of problems, to be honest. Like anybody who doubts the existence of the sensorial world around them has problems, I think. Okay. There's actually a name for that. Solipsism. It's a psychological condition. You think that you alone exist and all of this is imagined. You're just imagining it for yourself. Anyway, Descartes is famous in the canon for the method that he approaches philosophy with, and I want to urge us as we read the meditations this week and next that we approach the meditations from a charitable perspective and think about this in terms of method and not about whether we necessarily agree with his conclusions. Okay, his conclusions can be kind of hokey sometimes, but it is the approach that he took to the subject matter that was really influential and is the reason why he's such a powerful and vastly influential figure in the canon on down through the centuries. Okay, I think that's about it for Descartes. This is a good stopping point. There are a bunch of problems that Descartes' thought raises about philosophy and about the nature of the world, but I think this is a good stopping point for today, and we'll leave those problems for future class sessions. Yes?
This is more of a comment more than an inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
But I was thinking about how Descartes was thinking. I would not be able to live with his mindset.
Oh, I know.
I would have so many insecurities.
I know, me too.
How could you trust anyone? How could you trust anything?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. I think at a certain point as a human being, in order to live, you have to believe somebody and some things. And, I mean, he doubted even his own sensory perceptions, and that's not someplace I could go either.
And even then, he had his life before he was 30.
Mm-hmm.
So what about that life? Did he just consider that all fake?
Well, he could have made it up. His mind could have made it up, I suppose. I mean, if you want to take this methodological doubt to an extreme, I suppose he could have made it up. I would ask, like, some really hardcore solipsists, doubting type, like, why would the mind ever, if the mind is really conceiving of all of this, why would the mind ever come up with extremely painful scenarios for itself? Like, really painful scenarios, which, you know, sometimes we go through in life. Like, what mind would do this to itself? But anyway, if you are genuine solipsists, we'll be out in a minute. Genuine solipsists tend to have other problems. It's not really something that's taken seriously.